On a hot August morning in 216 BCE, on a wide, dusty plain in southern Italy, two of the greatest armies of the ancient Mediterranean faced each other across a shallow river. To the north of the field lay a small town the Romans called Cannae in the region of Apulia. Today, that name survives as Cannae della Battaglia, an archaeological site near the modern city of Barletta in the Italian region of Puglia. Farmers now drive tractors across these fields, growing wheat and tending olive trees, often unaware that beneath their wheels lies the soil where Rome came closer to destruction than at almost any other time in its history. On one side of the river stood the army of the Roman Republic, tens of thousands of citizen soldiers and Italian allies, arranged in thick, deep ranks. On the other side, drawn up in a long, thin line that curved gently outward, waited a Carthaginian army commanded by a man whose name had already become a nightmare in Rome, Hannibal Barca. The story of how these two forces came to this plain begins years earlier, when Hannibal, a young Carthaginian general, led his men and war elephants across the Alps and into Italy. He had already smashed Roman armies at the Trebia River and on the fog-bound shores of Lake Trasimene. Each time the Romans had tried to meet him head-on, they had suffered heavy losses. In response, a Roman leader named Fabius Maximus had adopted a different strategy: avoid major battles, harass Hannibal, cut off his supplies, and wear him down. Many in Rome, however, grew impatient with this cautious Fabian strategy. They wanted a decisive victory, a single massive clash that would crush the invader and restore Roman honor. By 216 BCE, Rome mustered its largest army yet for this purpose. Consuls were elected with a clear mandate to seek battle. One of them, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, was more cautious. The other, Gaius Terentius Varro, was more aggressive, eager to strike. Together, they brought perhaps 80,000 infantry and 6,000 to 8,000 cavalry into Apulia, to the region around Cannae, where Hannibal had seized a large Roman supply depot on the banks of the Ofontis River, known today as the Ofonto. Hannibal chose his ground with care. The open plain near Cannae, with the river on one side and low ridges in the distance, suited his mixture of heavy and light cavalry. He knew the Romans would want to use their numerical advantage in infantry, but he had other ideas. In the Roman camp, the two consuls alternated command day by day. Paulus wanted to be cautious, to avoid fighting on terrain chosen by Hannibal, to maneuver and wait for a better opportunity. Varro, by contrast, was determined to force a battle as soon as possible. Tension ran high in the councils of war, as officers debated whether to attack or hold back. Hannibal, for his part, watched and waited. He understood Roman pride. He knew that an army of this size, raised with such effort, would not linger forever in hesitation. He spent his time arranging his diverse troops, Spaniards, Gauls, North Africans, Numidian cavalry, and more, into a plan that, if it worked, would give him not just a victory, but something far more devastating. Just before dawn on that fateful day, both armies began to form their lines. The Romans crossed to the south bank of the Ofontis, or drew up along it, depending on the account. The early light glinted on thousands of bronze helmets and iron spearheads. They massed their infantry in the center, deeper than ever before. Legionaries packed in tight, shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield. Normally, they deployed in maniples with room to maneuver. Here, urged on by Varro's desire to break Hannibal's line by sheer weight, they formed a massive, dense block. On each flank, Roman and allied cavalry took their positions. The plan was simple. The cavalry would hold the wings while the central mass of infantry pushed forward, smashed through the Carthaginian center, and shredded the enemy army from the middle outward. Across the plain, Hannibal arranged his forces in a very different way. In the center, facing that approaching Roman block, he placed his Gaulish and Iberian infantry in a shallow outward curve. Their line was not straight, it bulged slightly toward the enemy. Behind them, set back a little, he stationed his more disciplined African infantry with heavier armor and longer spears. On the wings, he placed his greatest strength, heavy cavalry on one side under commanders like Hasdrubal, and agile Numidian horsemen on the other under Maharbal. As the sun climbed, dust began to rise from the tromping of tens of thousands of feet. The August heat settled over the Cannae plain. In the distance, the low hill where the town of ancient Cannae stood looked down on the coming storm. Before the armies closed, skirmishers stepped forward, slingers and javelin men from both sides. Stones and darts flew back and forth, wounding and killing a few, but their main purpose was to unsettle, to hide the larger movements behind a haze of noise and dust. Soon, the skirmishers fell back through the gaps in their own lines. The main bodies moved toward each other. The Roman infantry began a heavy, steady advance. Their front ranks raised their large rectangular shields, the scuta, and gripped their pila and swords. Behind them, rank after rank pressed forward. The formation was deeper than usual. Men in the rear barely saw the enemy, but they pushed, adding their weight to the mass ahead. Hannibal's center stepped forward to meet them. The Gaulish and Iberians in a front line shouted war cries, banging their swords on shields. When the two sides met, the impact was enormous. Metal rang on metal, wood splintered, men fell and were trampled as those behind pushed relentlessly into the fray. At first, the Roman plan seemed to be working. Their dense infantry block drove the Carthaginian central line backward. Step by step, the outward curve in Hannibal's formation straightened under the pressure. From the Roman point of view, this must have felt like progress. They were driving the enemy back, forcing them to yield ground. But this was exactly what Hannibal wanted. On the Carthaginian left wing, his heavy cavalry charged into the Roman horse opposite them. The clash of cavalry was brutal and swift. Carthaginian riders, often more experienced and perhaps better led, crashed into the Roman equites, driving many from their saddles. Dust enveloped the swirling melee, but the result was soon clear. The Roman left-wing cavalry began to break and flee. On the right, the Roman allied cavalry faced the nimble Numidians. These light horsemen did not charge in dense ranks. They darted forward, hurled javelins, and then wheeled away before their enemies could make full contact. Again and again, they harassed the Roman allies, drawing them out of position, wearing them down. As the Roman cavalry on both wings faltered and fled, Hannibal's horsemen did something crucial. They did not chase the fugitives all across the countryside. Instead, at least a large part of them regrouped, wheeled around behind the Roman infantry, and began to move toward the other flank. In the center, the Gaulish and Iberians continued to give ground, falling back under the Roman push. The once convex Carthaginian line now bent inward, as if the Romans were plunging into a bulging pocket, driving deeper and deeper, their sides now exposed. At the moment when the Carthaginian central troops had been pushed back far enough, Hannibal signaled his African infantry on both flanks. Fresh and relatively uncommitted until now, these well-armed soldiers stepped forward and pivoted inward, striking the Roman bloc on both sides.
Suddenly, the Roman infantry, still driving forward, felt spears and swords biting into their flanks. Those on the edges of the formation found enemies not only in front of them, but also on their right and left. At the same time, the Carthaginian cavalry, having routed the Roman horse, closed in from the rear. What had been a huge, powerful rectangle of legionaries now became a trapped mass of men. Surrounded on all sides, with enemies pressing in, they had nowhere to expand, nowhere to maneuver. The ranks were so tight that many could not raise their arms properly to strike or even to defend themselves. Ancient accounts describe the horror, men being crushed to death by the sheer weight of bodies around them, soldiers unable to fall when struck because those behind held them upright. others fighting desperately for space to breathe. The Romans had turned their numerical strength into a weakness. In that suffocating press, their training and discipline mattered less than Hannibal's geometrical trap. Inside that living ring of iron and flesh, officers tried to organize resistance. Standards were raised, commands were shouted, but in the dust and the screams, signals were lost. Units that were supposed to pivot or redeploy remained frozen in place, simply because there was no room. The consuls found themselves caught in different parts of the maelstrom. Paulus, the more cautious leader, was wounded and, according to tradition, refused opportunities to escape, choosing instead to die with his men. Varro, the more aggressive one, whose command day this was, managed to flee with a small group of cavalry and would face the Senate afterward with the shame of survival. On the outer ring, Carthaginian and allied troops pressed in, methodically cutting down the trapped Romans. What had begun as a collision of armies became more like a prolonged slaughter. The battle lasted for hours, but by the end of the day, the Roman army in the field was effectively destroyed. Estimates vary, but ancient sources suggest that as many as 50,000 to 70,000 Roman and allied soldiers were killed at Cannae, with tens of thousands more captured. Nearly the entire leadership of the army fell. It was, by any measure, one of the greatest tactical victories ever recorded, and one of Rome's darkest days. When word of the disaster reached Rome, panic and grief swept the city. Families filled the streets, desperate for news of loved ones. Many names were never confirmed, only assumed lost. The Senate met in emergency session. Some voices whispered that perhaps now was the time to negotiate, to make terms with Hannibal. Yet, in this moment, the Republic did something surprising. It chose not to surrender. Instead of suing for peace, the Senate ordered new levies. Boys barely of age and even slaves were armed and formed into new units. Fabius Maximus's strategy of delay and harassment, once despised by many, now seemed wise. Rome pulled back from major pitched battles, shadowing Hannibal, cutting his supply lines, and slowly grinding down his position in Italy. For Hannibal, Cannae was a masterpiece of tactics, a double envelopment executed on a gigantic scale, turning his opponent's mass and momentum against them. Many later generals, from Frederick the Great to Napoleon to modern staff colleges, would study Cannae as the definition of how to destroy a larger army by maneuver rather than numbers. But strategically, the victory did not give Hannibal what he most needed, a way to crack Rome itself. Some Italian cities defected to his side after Cannae, but not enough. The walls of Rome remained untouched. Carthage, across the sea, was cautious in sending reinforcements. The war would drag on for many years more, eventually shifting back to Africa, where Hannibal would finally be defeated at Zama by a Roman general named Scipio. Today, if you stand on the low rise of Cannae della Battaglia and look out across the Ofanto Valley, you will see fields, vineyards, and the bright white walls of farmhouses. A small church, built long after the battle, stands where ancient Cannae once rose. Information boards and modest monuments mark the site, but there are no towering statues or vast memorials. A land has returned to its quiet routine. Archaeologists who work here sift through the soil, finding occasional fragments of weapons, bits of armor, or Roman coins that may or may not have fallen during the battle. They compare the contours of the ground with the descriptions given by ancient historians like Polydius and Livy, trying to match words to earth. In museums in the region and in Rome, exhibits on the Second Punic War show visitors how legionaries and Carthaginian soldiers were equipped, how the formations looked from above, and how Hannibal's encirclement tightened like a noose.
Classroom maps with colored blocks and arrows trace the moves that turned a proud Roman army into a trapped mass of men on a single, terrible day in Apulia. The place where it happened has a different name now. Cannae is Cannae della Battaglia in modern Puglia. Its people are not soldiers, but farmers, shopkeepers, and commuters. Their concerns are not Roman honor or Carthaginian strategy, but weather forecasts, fuel prices, and school exams. Yet the ground remembers in its own way, and as long as people study history, the name of Cannae will stand for one of war's most chilling lessons, that even the mightiest power can be brought to the brink of ruin by a single day's decisions on a plain by a river under a hot summer sun.